Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the righteous shall live by faith. But what does a life of faith look like? Join us as we meditate on the wisdom literature of ancient Israel and the teachings of the apostles of Jesus Christ. This week, we're in the book of Proverbs. I'm Ella Stoller, and I'm here with Doug Fichter and Joe Lehman. Garrett Tonner is the editor for this episode.
In this week's reading, we come across a very familiar phrase in chapter 19, verse 23. This verse begins with, the fear of the Lord.
Well, that always catches my attention.
Yeah, right. Previously, we read that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 19:23 has a little different twist, stating that the fear of the Lord leads to life. If we want true life, we should begin with reverent awe and submission to God.
You know, it seems like Solomon is secretly building upon this theme.
Yeah, in looking a little closer, it seems Proverbs 19:23 is actually the culmination of a group of verses, which starts at verse 16. The ESV Study Bible says, these verses lay out some essential features of a good life. This list moves from basic principles of wisdom to the significance of love, and then finally to fearing God as the supreme principle of life.
Let's jump back to verse 16 and see what it says. Whosoever keeps the commandment keeps his life. So the groundwork or foundation for a good life starts by obeying God's command.
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent place to start. Then as we move through these features of a good life that we talk about, we find instructions to be generous in verse 17, instructions to discipline your children in verse 18. Verse 19 is a little less clear, but basically it says to avoid friendships or associations with those who lack self-control.
Nice. Those verses sound like good advice and instruction to me. And what does verse 20 say?
Listen to advice and accept instruction so that you may gain wisdom in the future. That's certainly not hard to understand, but maybe a little hard to practice.
Yeah, for sure. Verse 21 then gives more good instruction that we are to listen to. We need to acknowledge the fact that God may have greater plans than we can even imagine. It says, many are the plans in the mind of the man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. We go ahead and make plans, but always with the mindset of James 4:15. If the Lord wills, we will do this or that.
Gotcha. So there are so many good instructions for life in this bouquet of verses.
Yeah, I like that bouquet. We're getting close to the final flower in this bouquet, but one more verse as it builds up to the complete arrangement. One of you want to read the first part of verse 22?
Sure. What is desired in man is steadfast love. Love is another key ingredient to a good life.
Yeah, again, this thought flows right into the New Testament. When the Pharisees were trying to test Jesus by asking which of the commandments is the greatest, he said, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
The great commandment.
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of what it meant in verse 16, obeying God's commandment. Also, I like the word steadfast. God desires for us to be loyal, true, committed, faithful, steadfast in our love for Him and for others.
Yeah, let's move on to the final verse in this group, which started this discussion. The fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. As I said earlier, this is really the culmination or the final flower in the bouquet. You could look at verses 16 and 23 as bookends to this group. Keeping God's commandments, verse 16, and fearing Him, and verse 23, not only leads to life, but also to satisfaction and contentment.
In this week's reading, I noticed quite a few verses that are commonly quoted and referred to often in sermons or books or podcasts, verses you might find on plaques or cards or give out to encourage others.
Yeah, I noticed a few of those too, like Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born of adversity. Or another tried and true scripture in Proverbs is Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Oh, yeah. Or how about, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And since we're on that track, how about the verse that says it is better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman.
Solomon had a lot of experience with obtaining wives, and I imagine he had some experience with dwelling in the wilderness, or at least wishing he was in the wilderness. Though, in all seriousness, though, these are very familiar verses, but I thought it would be beneficial for our listeners if we do a deep dive into Proverbs that is not as familiar. Proverbs 17:3 was one that caught my attention. Could you read that for me, Joe?
Sure. The refining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the hearts.
So what does "but the Lord tests the hearts" mean?
Well, let's look at some commentary found in Blue Letter Bible. One commentary says, there are appropriate places where things are tested, and purified silver and gold each have their place of refining and purification. So this verse is saying silver is refined in a pot, gold in the furnace. But what does the last part of the verse mean when it says, but the Lord tests the hearts?
In a Hebrew poem, each line is meant to build upon the previous one. In this case, I'm thinking the refining process for precious metals is meant to be a metaphor for how Yahweh tests hearts.
Okay, so the Lord purifies our hearts, just like the pot purifies silver and the furnace purifies gold. God is the place in which we find wisdom and truth that then purifies the inner man or woman.
Right. It's interesting to me that he is used to purify in the first two examples. And that got me thinking of Peter's teachings in the New Testament when he said, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, that ye may be glad also with exceeding joy." So, through the fires and tests, we are purified into Christ's likeness, and then give glory back to God through suffering well.
Yep. Just like silver and gold were refined with fire, we humans are refined by the Lord, and it shouldn't surprise us when he uses a little bit of heat or fiery trials to purify us and draw us closer to himself.
Listeners, as you read through many Proverbs this week, I encourage you to stop and meditate on just one, even if it means you skim over others. Prayerfully choose one proverb and make it your focus. Think about its structure and ask yourself if Solomon is using any figurative language. Think about other Bible passages that connect to the proverb, and then ask God to help you faithfully respond to its message.
Okay, before we finish this episode, let's take a look at another bouquet of Proverbs in our reading this week.
Yes, please. Ever since you pointed out this whole concept of how Solomon clustered the Proverbs together, I've been blistering my eyes trying to discern the clusters, or bouquets as you call them. This is way harder than it sounds. Every now and then I spot a repeated word or a theme, but I never seem to be able to discern a literary unit like the one you showed us last week.
Well, don't feel bad, Ella. I can't quite find them either. That's why I cheat and use a technical commentary. The bouquet that I want to study this week was laid out in the New International Commentary.
Yeah, this makes me thankful for the subtitles that have been placed in my Bible. It's nice to have the text broken into coherent chunks.
Right, and the Proverbs don't really do that, but we're going to look at a bouquet close to Friday's reading. Let's turn to chapter 22 and read the first 9 verses. I'll read them in the NASB. It's a good word-for-word style translation for looking at Hebrew poetry. A good name is to be more desired than great wealth. Favor is better than silver and gold. The rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all. The prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards himself will be far from them. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. He who sows iniquity will reap vanity, and the rod of his fury will perish. He who is generous will be blessed, for he gives some of his food to the poor. Okay, guys, what did you notice? And listeners, as we talk this through, you can click on the show notes link and find a PDF breakdown of this entire cluster of Proverbs.
Okay, so let's look at it. At first glance, there's not much to tie things together here. It seems they stand on their own.
Right. Just as you said, each proverb is supposed to stand on its own. It's its own literary unit. There's some bonus wisdom that comes from reading these guys as a literary unit. So reading them all together has like a little bonus feature of
I
wisdom.
like bonuses.
Okay, yeah. So I'm seeing the reoccurring theme of wealth, and in verse 2 and 7, they both mention rich and the poor.
Yeah, good catch, Ella. These proverbs have to do with the allurement of wealth. What do you think the center or the apex of the verse, or the apex of the cluster is?
Well, I'm tempted to say it's one of the verses that refers to Yahweh. I'm going with verse 4. It's kind of in the middle. It has that phrase from our theme this year, the fear of the Lord.
You're right. When in doubt, the Lord is always the right answer.
Yes.
In Sunday school and on the podcast. The big flower in the middle of this bouquet says, the reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life.
Okay, so if verse 2 and 7 are mirroring one another, and verse 4 is the apex, then that means verse 3 should mirror verse 5. So, verse 3, the prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. Then verse 5, thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards himself will be far from them. Okay, I see. So, hides himself in verse 3 lines up with guards himself in verse 5.
That's right. And in Hebrew, the words for hide and guard actually rhyme. That just leaves us verse 1 at the beginning of the cluster and verse 8 and 9 at the end. These are tied together by the presence of synonyms like favor and blessing and antonyms like good and vanity. Okay, so knowing all that, Doug, what do you think the bonus wisdom in this cluster is? What does this whole bouquet mean?
Okay, well, working in from the outside, it seems that having a good character is better than getting wealth. And even though the rich rule over the poor, it's good to remember that the Lord rules over both of them.
And the prudent sees evil and protects himself. In context, the evil might be something like the temptation to break God's law or to get wealth.
Right. And the humble person who resists this temptation out of the fear of the Lord most likely will find riches, honor, and life.
I like it. Well done, you guys.
Listeners, thank you for joining us this week as we smelled the proverbial flowers of Solomon's wisdom and basked in the fragrance of God's glory and goodness. We pray that you have a great week, and may the Spirit of wisdom be with you until you join us again next time on the Bluffton Biblecast.